The highest point on the eastern seaboard south of Maine is not a mountain, it is a hill on Staten Island, rising approximately 400 feet above the water that surrounds it on three sides, and on that hill, in a 17-room mansion that its builder had modeled on the building at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the boss of the largest organized crime family in America was receiving visitors, running an organization that touched billions of dollars in commerce and conducting a romantic relationship with his housekeeper, while federal agents listened to every word from a device they had placed in his kitchen. Below the hill and across the water, in the neighborhoods where the actual work of the organization was done, the men who were supposed to be loyal to him were meeting to plan his murder. He did not know. The hill was supposed to protect him from exactly this kind of problem, and the hill had failed, and the failure was total. His name was Paul Castellano. He was known as Big Paul and as the Pope, and his organization was the Gambino crime family, the largest and most profitable criminal enterprise in the United States. He had inherited it from the man who built it, his cousin and brother-in-law, who had spent 19 years making it into something unprecedented, and then handed it to someone who, in the judgment of the men who served under him, had never fully understood what it required. The story of what Paul Castellano built and what he missed, and what happened on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan on the evening of December 16th, 1985, is the story of how power and distance interact when a man mistakes one for protection from the other. Drop where you are watching from in the comments. This is one of the most consequential and least fully understood stories in the history of American organized crime, and the further into it you get, the more each detail changes the meaning of the ones before it. If you are new here and want more history like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to Staten Island and the man on the hill who never saw what was coming. Constantino Paul Castellano was born on June 26, 1915, in Brooklyn, New York, the son of a butcher who had brought his trade and his connections from Sicily to the close-packed Italian-American immigrant neighborhood where most of what mattered in his son's future life had already been arranged before the son was old enough to understand it. His father worked in the meat business and had early involvement with the criminal organization then known as the Mangano family, the organization that would eventually, under different leadership and a different name, become the most powerful criminal enterprise in the country. Growing up within reach of that world in the 1920s and 1930s meant that organized crime was not a career option among several others. It was the visible economic and social organizing principle of the neighborhood, a fact as present as the street signs. Brooklyn in that era, for a boy from a working-class Sicilian immigrant family with the right connections, was a place where certain paths were mapped out early. The schools were not the path most of the men around him were taking. Castellano left school after the 8th grade and became a butcher, following the trade his father had brought from the old country. The decision was not a dramatic one. It was the ordinary decision of a boy in his circumstances, doing what the men around him did, learning the trade that was in front of him, and beginning, at the same time, to absorb the other curriculum the neighborhood was offering. His first documented legal consequence came in 1934, when he was 19 years old and was arrested and convicted of robbery in Connecticut. He served 3 months in prison. The detail that the historical record has preserved from this episode is that he refused to identify his accomplices. In the world he was entering, that refusal was not simply a legal strategy, it was a statement of values, and it was heard as one. He came out of prison with a reputation that the 3 months themselves had not earned, but that the manner of how he served them had. After his release, he returned to the meat business and continued the dual education that was happening simultaneously on the criminal and the legitimate sides of his life. Then, in 1932, 3 years before his conviction and well before he had accumulated any particular standing on his own, something had already happened that would determine the arc of everything that followed. His sister Catherine had married a man named Carlo Gambino. Carlo and Paul were already first cousins. The families had been connected in Sicily and had come to Brooklyn in proximity to each other. The marriage between Carlo and Catherine made them brothers-in-law as well, the kind of double bond that in the world they both inhabited carried a weight that almost no other kind of relationship could match. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy would later order an investigation specifically into the degree of intermarriage within these families, a measure of how unusual the arrangement appeared from the outside and how central it was to everything the organization built. In the world that shaped Paul Castellano, no connection carried more weight than family, and the connection between his sister and the man who was going to run New York's most powerful criminal organization for the next 4 decades was the connection that everything else in his life would ultimately derive from. The man whose name the family would eventually carry arrived in the United States in 1921 without legal permission because his visa application had been denied. He came as a stowaway, made his way to Brooklyn where his Castellano cousins had settled, and began the long, careful, patient process of inserting himself into the criminal organization that was already operating in the immigrant community around him. Carlo Gambino had specific qualities that set him apart from virtually every other ambitious man in the same world. He was strategic rather than impulsive. He cultivated relationships rather than commanding them. He planned over years rather than over days, and he had an almost supernatural capacity for reading the difference between what appeared to be true and what was actually true. These qualities would eventually take him to the top of an organization that destroyed most of the men around him who lacked them. He rose through the Mangano crime family in the 1930s and 1940s, absorbing the rhythms of the organization, building relationships, and positioning himself carefully without moving too quickly. Then, on October 25, 1957, the barber chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan became the location of the most consequential murder in the recent history of New York organized crime. Albert Anastasia, the boss of what had been the Mangano family and the man who had run the most feared organization of killers in American criminal history, was shot to death while he sat with a hot towel on his face and a barber working around his ears. The chair was the specific detail that newspapers and investigators and historians would carry forward because it captured something about the nature of the world Anastasia had inhabited. A man who had been feared everywhere could still be found in the same chair on the same Tuesday morning. Carlo Gambino emerged from the resulting reorganization as boss of the renamed family. Within weeks of the Anastasia murder, in November of that same year, the most senior figures of the National Organized Crime Network gathered at the estate of a man named Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, a small town in upstate New York, for a summit meeting intended to ratify the new order and settle questions left unresolved by the change in leadership. State police spotted the gathering and moved in. Dozens of men were arrested, including Paul Castellano, who had been invited to the Appalachian meeting because his standing within the organization by 1957 was already significant enough to qualify him for a seat at a table that most members of the families in New York would never see. He was later convicted of contempt of court for refusing to testify about what he had seen there. It was, in the context of the values he had been demonstrating since Connecticut in 1934, entirely consistent behavior. In the years that followed, Castellano built his role within the organization that his brother-in-law was running. He managed his legitimate businesses, which centered on the meat and poultry industry, and he moved steadily through the organizational hierarchy, becoming a captain and eventually one of Carlo's most trusted advisors on the operations of the family's commercial relationships. The qualities Carlo most valued, caution, precision, and instinct for the white-collar operation over the street-level confrontation, were the qualities Castellano had been demonstrating since his earliest involvement. By the time Carlo was in his early 70s and the question of succession had become impossible to avoid, the man whose sister he had married had spent more than 2 decades showing that the direction Carlo wanted the family to continue moving was the direction Castellano was already going. Carlo Gambino was 74 years old when his heart failed, and he had accomplished something that almost no organized crime boss in American history had managed. He died in his own bed at home on October 15th, 1976, at his residence in Massapequa on Long Island, without having spent the years immediately preceding his death in federal prison, and without having spent his final moments in someone else's sights. He had outlived, outmaneuvered, and in some cases outlasted the death of every significant rival of his generation. The family he left behind was, by every available measure, the largest and most powerful in New York. Two men were plausible successors. The contrast between them was the contrast between the two things the organization had always required and had never found a way to fully reconcile. Agnello della Croce was born on January 15th, 1914 in Brooklyn, and had spent his entire adult life in the organization in the way that Castellano, for all his connections, had not. He had served time in prison, had done the street-level work that built the specific kind of loyalty that social clubs and neighborhood presence created, and had accumulated the kind of institutional standing that came from decades of being present in the right way at the right moments. He commanded the faction of the family that included the street soldiers, the men who did the most dangerous work and who lived closest to the consequences of that work every single day. His reputation was not built on business relationships. It was built on the street itself, and the men on the street knew it. By every conventional measure the organization had always applied to questions of succession, Della Croce was the natural choice. He was the underboss. He had the relationships, the standing, and the institutional weight that the position naturally implied. Carlo chose Castellano. The reasons for the choice have been examined in court testimony, investigative journalism, and academic research across the decades since. The picture that emerges is consistent. Carlo saw in Castellano a temperamental alignment with the direction he had been moving the family for 2 decades. Castellano would not take unnecessary risks. He would not start wars that did not need to be started. He understood white-collar operations and had been running them his entire career. He was Sicilian-born, a distinction that mattered in the hierarchy Carlo had built, and he was, in a bond that Carlo valued above most other things, family. Della Croce could have challenged the decision. He had the standing to do so and the following to make it viable. He chose instead to accept it, and he made that acceptance public. He told his men that Castellano was boss, and that the family should stand behind him as one. The announcement came from the man his people trusted most, and it prevented the war that might otherwise have begun immediately. Della Croce remained as underboss, retained authority over his own faction, and continued to operate with the autonomy that the arrangement required him to have. The structure Carlo built to contain the conflict depended on 2 things. The Castellano would never do something so offensive to Della Croce's people that the arrangement became impossible to maintain, and that Della Croce would remain alive and capable of holding his men to the decision he had made. Neither condition would prove permanent. For the moment, in the autumn of 1976, it held. Castellano moved to Staten Island and began making the most consequential real estate decision of his life. Todt Hill is not a neighborhood that announces itself. It sits in the center of Staten Island, rising from the surrounding flatlands to a height of approximately 400 feet above sea level, the highest point on the Eastern Seaboard south of Maine, a geographic distinction that its residents note with the mild pride attached to any local fact that sets a place apart from ordinary geography. The houses there are large, set back from roads that carry light traffic, surrounded by landscaping that communicates wealth without advertising it. In almost any other context, it would be a neighborhood where nothing of particular note ever happened. Paul Castellano built a mansion at the top. The structure, which eventually contained 17 rooms and sat on carefully maintained grounds with a view of the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge, was designed to suggest the building at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, a resemblance intentional enough and visible enough that everyone in and around the Gambino organization referred to it immediately and consistently as the White House. It had the right elements: the columned facade, the long approach, the sense of a residence designed to communicate that the person living in it occupied a different order of existence from the people coming to see them. That was exactly what it communicated, and that was exactly the problem. The bosses who had preceded Castellano, including Carlo, had maintained a version of distance from street operations, while also maintaining the kinds of regular human contact that kept trust alive within the hierarchy. Carlo received visitors. He was present in the ways that mattered even when he was careful about the circumstances. The distance he maintained was operational, not personal. He did not put himself above the culture. He navigated within it with exceptional skill. Castellano's White House was something different. It was a physical statement that the boss lived up here and that people who wanted to see him came to the Hill. His captains made the trip to Staten Island to pay tribute and report in, rather than the boss appearing in their neighborhoods to receive them. The driveway, the grounds, the mansion itself, all of it communicated a hierarchy that the street world had always tried to balance against a sense of shared enterprise that made the hierarchy legitimate in the eyes of the people it depended on. Castellano's White House did not make that balance. It declared the hierarchy and let the legitimacy take care of itself. It did not, in time, take care of itself. The men who made the trip up the hill and paid their tribute and drove back down began to develop a consistent interpretation of what the journey required of them and what they received in return. The resentment did not announce itself. It accumulated. What the isolation on Todt Hill was designed to protect was not modest. The Gambino family under Paul Castellano was, by any reasonable measure of criminal enterprise, the largest and most profitable organization of its kind, operating anywhere in the United States. Its reach extended into industries that most Americans interacted with daily without any awareness that a percentage of what they paid was being collected by an organization with the headquarters on a hilltop in Staten Island. The construction industry was the clearest example of how the arrangement worked at its most sophisticated. The 5 New York families had built what investigators called the Concrete Club, an arrangement under which any construction project in New York City, requiring a concrete pour above $2 million, required the involvement and approval of the organized crime network that controlled the Concrete Workers Union. Contractors paid for the arrangement or watched their projects stop. The Gambino family's position in this structure gave it a hand in virtually every major building going up in the city. Civic projects, commercial towers, residential developments. The concrete was poured with the percentage flowing upward through the union structure and outward to the families. The garment district operations were similarly embedded in legitimate commerce. Thomas Gambino, Carlo's son and Castellano's second cousin, managed the family's trucking interests in Manhattan's garment trade, which meant that clothing manufacturers who needed their goods moved paid not just for the trucks but for the continued ability to operate without disruption. The waterfront gave the family parallel influence over the commerce moving through the ports. The longshoremen's union, which Gambino family relationships had penetrated for decades, ensured that the family's hand was present in everything that arrived and departed by ship. Castellano's legitimate businesses anchored the whole structure. His poultry and meat operations, including the company known as Dial Poultry, generated revenues in the tens of millions of dollars annually. The businesses were real, they employed real workers, and they gave him a position in legitimate commerce that allowed him to conduct relationships and manage operations with a flexibility that a man with no legitimate business presence could not have managed. Within the family, the crew run by Roy DeMeo had operated one of the most prolific criminal enterprises in the city's history, running vehicle theft and chop shop businesses across the metropolitan area at a scale that was, in terms of both organization and volume, remarkable even by the standards of organized crime in New York. By January of 1983, DeMeo had become a serious liability. The number of murders his crew had committed, many of them unauthorized, had accumulated to a point where the attention they were drawing threatened the broader organizational structure. Castellano ordered DeMeo killed. His body was found in the trunk of a car on January 10th, 1983. The specific decision, removing someone who had become a threat to the organization's insulation, was exactly the kind of calculation Castellano made well. It was the same calculation, applied to a different scale, that he had consistently failed to make about the people directly below him. Against everything that the family was generating, there was one category of activity that Paul Castellano had determined to prohibit. He issued and attempted to enforce a ban on narcotics trafficking within the Gambino family. The stated penalty for violation was death. The reasoning behind the ban was not principled in any meaningful sense. It was practical. The narcotics trade had demonstrated repeatedly and with specific personal consequences that it was the fastest path to the most severe federal sentences. Vito Genovese had died in federal prison after a narcotics conviction. Multiple significant figures across all 5 families had received sentences that ended their careers and sometimes their lives behind bars. The calculation Castellano made was straightforward. The returns from drug dealing did not justify the risk of prosecution, and the risk of prosecution in the narcotics trade dwarfed the risk in every other enterprise the family ran. The calculation was organizationally rational. It was also organizationally catastrophic because it created a situation in which the men most committed to the enterprise he had forbidden had the most direct personal stake in removing him. Several members of the Gotti faction were deeply invested in narcotics trafficking and had been conducting it in violation of Castellano's prohibition. The most significant flashpoint came in 1983 when Angelo Ruggiero, one of Gotti's closest associates, was arrested on heroin trafficking charges alongside Gene Gotti, John's brother. The evidence in the case included surveillance recordings of Ruggiero's conversations. Those recordings captured not only extensive discussions of the drug operation, but also, according to what would later come out in various proceedings, disparaging remarks about Castellano made by members of the crew. Castellano demanded to see the transcripts of the Ruggiero tapes. Gotti resisted. He deployed every available procedural mechanism to delay the production of the transcripts, because he understood that what was in them would not only document the drug dealing he had been covering for, but would also give Castellano specific personal reasons to act against him and his people beyond the general prohibition. The standoff continued through 1983 and into 1984. Castellano was pressing. Gotti was stalling. The men around Gotti understood that the pressure was not going to stop, and that when it finally resolved itself, the resolution was not likely to be favorable to them. The organization had given Castellano the specific authority to kill them for what the tapes documented. The only question was whether he would exercise it before they could prevent him from doing so. While that internal confrontation was developing, a parallel investigation was building an entirely separate threat to Castellano's position and his freedom. In 1983, FBI agents Joe O'Brien and Andres Currens succeeded in placing a listening device in the kitchen of the White House on Todt Hill. The device was not immediately discovered. Castellano conducted his business there, as he always had, in his kitchen, at his table, while federal equipment recorded every word. The bug produced approximately 600 hours of recorded conversations before the investigation moved to its next phase. What those recordings captured was extensive. Discussions of the family's construction operations and its influence over labor unions, the mechanics of how payments moved through legitimate business fronts, the specific language of men who understood exactly what they were doing and were not particularly careful about saying so at their own kitchen table. One passage preserved Castellano telling an associate that no one came to Staten Island without his permission. Another recorded him telling a captain that their purpose was to run the unions. The material was precisely what the federal investigators needed. The recordings also captured, in detail that would later become part of the public record, the relationship between Castellano and Gloria Olarte. She was a Colombian immigrant who had come to work as his live-in housekeeper sometime in the late 1970s or early 1980s. The relationship that developed was not a secret within the household. Nina Castellano, his wife, lived in the same house and was aware of what was happening. Gloria could be heard in the recorded conversations, sometimes hovering in the background of criminal discussions, sometimes entering the conversation herself. The affair was, by any measure, Castellano's most significant personal entanglement in the final years of his life, and the federal government now had documentation of it that his own organization did not. On February 25, 1985, the indictments came. The commission case was the most comprehensive organized crime prosecution ever assembled against the leadership of the New York families. The investigation behind it had run for 5 years, had authorized 171 court-approved wiretaps, and had deployed more than 200 federal agents. The original 15-count indictment named 9 defendants. Paul Castellano was listed as boss of the Gambino family. The charges covered narcotics trafficking, loan sharking, gambling, labor racketeering, and extortion against construction companies. By the time the trial began, 18 months later, the indictment had grown to 25 counts. Castellano was simultaneously under indictment in the automobile theft case connected to the DiMeo cruise operations. He was facing the realistic possibility, on 2 separate federal tracks, of spending the rest of his life in prison. He posted $2 million in bail and began preparing his legal defense. He was 70 years old. The question of what happened to the organization if he was convicted and imprisoned was one he had not fully resolved, and the people below him knew it. Through most of 1985, the one figure in the Gambino family whose presence had held the two-faction structure together since 1976 was dying. Agnello Della Croce had been diagnosed with cancer, and by the middle of the year, the progression had made the outcome clear. He was 71 years old, and the cancer was advancing in the specific way that left no room for hope, while leaving enough time for the people around him to contemplate what his absence would mean. His faction knew. The family hierarchy knew. Castellano knew. Della Croce had been the living embodiment of the arrangement. His public endorsement of Castellano's authority in 1976 had been the single thing most responsible for preventing an internal war at the moment of succession. His continued presence as underboss had been the reason the Della Croce faction, despite 9 years of accumulating grievances, had not acted on those grievances in any organized way. The street soldiers deferred to his judgment, and his judgment had been, consistently, that the arrangement Carlo had made should be honored. Without him, that judgment had no institutional weight. Castellano did not visit Della Croce as he was dying. The explanations that could be offered for this absence were legally reasonable. An active boss, facing 2 major federal indictments, had genuine reasons not to make public appearances at the home or hospital room of a dying organized crime underboss. The surveillance, the associations, the potential complications. A lawyer would have said the same thing. The legal reasoning was sound. The organizational reasoning was catastrophic. In the world Della Croce's men inhabited, obligation was not a concept that bent to legal advice. A man who did not visit his dying underboss was making a statement, whatever his reasons, and the statement was that the obligations the culture required did not apply equally to the man at the top. The absence was experienced not as a legal necessity, but as a confirmation of everything the street soldiers had been observing for 9 years, that the boss's calculations did not include them in the way the culture said they should be included. Agnello Della Croce died on December 2nd, 1985. He was 71 years old. The arrangement he had sustained through personal authority and deliberate restraint was now sustained by nothing but the institutional form it had taken, and institutional forms, without the person who gave them weight, do not hold for long. Castellano did not attend the wake. Within days of Della Croce's death, before the men of his faction had processed what the death meant and what came next, Castellano announced the appointment of Thomas Bilotti as the new underboss of the Gambino family. Bilotti had been Castellano's driver, his bodyguard, and his most constant personal companion. He had been elevated over more senior figures at multiple points in his career, each elevation a demonstration that proximity to the boss counted more in Castellano's organization than the decades of institutional standing the traditional hierarchy was supposed to reward. He was loyal to Castellano personally. He was not a man who commanded respect in the Della Croce faction, or who had built the kind of organizational relationships that would have made his appointment acceptable to the people who would be serving under him. The appointment was the final piece. Taken together with the 9 years of hilltop isolation, the drug prohibition that had made the Gotti faction's activities criminal under family law, the Ruggiero tape standoff, the absence from Della Croce's deathbed, and the absence from the wake, the Bilotti appointment told the men below the hill what they had already been concluding, that the boss's priorities did not include them, that his version of the organization was one in which personal loyalty to him mattered more than institutional standing earned over decades, and that waiting for things to improve was not going to produce a different result. 2 weeks after Della Croce's death, the date was December 16th. What happened in the weeks between that death and December 16th was not a decision made in a single meeting or announced in a formal deliberation. It was a consensus assembled through conversations among men who had been performing the same calculation for different amounts of time and who had all arrived at the same conclusion by different routes. John Gotti was the central figure. He had been performing the calculation since at least 1983, when the Ruggiero tapes first made it clear that his position within the family was directly threatened by what Castellano knew or was going to know. The Della Croce death removed the only constraint he had consistently honored, which was his respect for his mentor's judgment and his mentor's stated position that the arrangement should be preserved. Salvatore Gravano was deeply involved. He had the operational experience and the organizational relationships that converted a decision into a plan. Frank DeCicco was essential. He was a captain with the relationships across both factions and the standing to approach other captains and make the case that the change was not just desirable, but necessary and viable. He worked through December to identify which captains would support the transition, which would acquiesce, and which would need to be managed after the fact. His conversations were careful and his assessments were accurate. The decision not to seek commission approval was deliberate. The protocol existed for exactly the reason it sounds, to prevent every dispute over a boss from becoming a war between families. Going outside the protocol meant the conspirators would be accountable to the other families for what they had done. They calculated that the change, once accomplished, would be accepted as a fait accompli, that Castellano's legal situation made his removal understandable in practical terms, and that the scale of the Gambino family made a direct confrontation over the decision more costly to everyone than accepting the result. DeCicco arranged a dinner meeting at Sparks Steakhouse, 210 East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan, for the evening of December 16th, 1985. Castellano was told the meeting was for a legitimate business discussion. He had no reason to doubt it. The restaurant was a well-known Midtown fixture, the kind of establishment where men of his standing regularly appeared, and DeCicco had arranged similar meetings before. The hit team included Salvatore Scala, Edward Lino, and John Carneglia among the primary shooters. They were stationed near the restaurant's entrance, disguised in trench coats and Russian-style fur hats against the December cold, with additional backup positioned down the street. Gotti and Gravano would arrive early and park a car at the corner of East 46th Street and 3rd Avenue, facing east toward the restaurant, close enough to observe and far enough to communicate via walkie-talkie without being in the area of the shooting. Everything was prepared. What remained was for Paul Castellano to keep the appointment that had been designed around him. The evening of December 16th, 1985, was cold in New York, the ordinary cold of mid-December in a city that does not pause for weather. The streets around East 46th Street were busy in the way that Midtown Manhattan is busy at the end of a Tuesday afternoon in the week before Christmas, office workers finishing their days, shoppers moving between stores, the specific energy of a major commercial area at the beginning of an evening that most of the people in it were looking forward to. Gotti and Gravano arrived early and positioned their car at the corner of East 46th and 3rd Avenue, where the tinted windows meant they could see without being seen. The walkie-talkie connected them to the men on foot near Sparks. The afternoon light was fading, and the Christmas decorations on the buildings were beginning to matter more as the sky darkened. Paul Castellano's black Lincoln Continental appeared on East 46th Street and moved toward the restaurant. Inside, Castellano in the passenger seat, Bellotti driving, both men dressed for a business dinner in Midtown. The car had a Patrolmen's Benevolent Association sticker in the rear window, a detail that struck investigators afterward for the questions it raised and the irony it contained. At 5:16 in the evening, the Lincoln stopped in front of the restaurant. As Castellano began to exit from the passenger side, the men stationed near the entrance moved. Salvatore Scala, Edward Lino, and John Coneglia approached with semi-automatic weapons and opened fire. Castellano was shot 6 times. He collapsed on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, on the pavement in front of the entrance, in full view of anyone on the street around him. Thomas Bellotti exited from the driver's side. He had been Castellano's closest companion for years, the man who had been with him through everything, elevated to underboss just days before. He had no warning and no chance. He was approached from behind and shot. He was 47 years old, and he died on East 46th Street beside the man he had served. Gotti drove his car slowly through the scene after the shooting, close enough to confirm that both men were down, and then continued out of the area. Gravano later described the moment with the directness that characterized his subsequent cooperation with federal prosecutors. Police arrived within minutes. The scene was surrounded quickly enough that the photographers who got there earliest were capturing images before investigators had established a perimeter. A New York Daily News photographer arrived while the bodies were still exactly where they had fallen and took pictures without initially knowing who the dead men were, prompted by a police officer who told him to keep shooting. The portable lighting that the investigation required arrived and transformed the block into something that contemporaneous reporting described as a macabre film set, except that the two men on the pavement were not performing. Paul Castellano was 70 years old. He had been boss of the Gambino crime family for 9 years and approximately 2 months. He had run the largest criminal enterprise in the United States from a hilltop 17 rooms above the street level, where his men did the work that kept the organization alive, and the men below the hill had put him on the sidewalk of a midtown restaurant during the Christmas shopping rush, because the distance between the hill and the street had never been as protective as he had needed it to be. John Gotti was 45 years old on the night Paul Castellano died, and he wasted very little time demonstrating that he and the man he had replaced were going to conduct themselves according to entirely opposite principles. He moved quickly to consolidate authority, naming Ditsiko his underboss and reorganizing the family around his own presence, rather than around the administrative structure Castellano had built. Where Castellano had retreated to Todt Hill, Gotti held court publicly at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, in full view of the FBI photographers who documented everyone who came and went. Where Castellano had avoided cameras and press attention to the point where law enforcement agencies had once disagreed about his age, Gotti embraced the visibility, waving to reporters, dining openly, wearing suits that cost more than most of his soldiers earned in a month. The tabloids gave him a name, the Dapper Don. He acquired a reputation for acquittals that led them to add a second name, the Teflon Don. The Commission, and in particular Vincent Gigante, who ran the Genovese family from Sullivan Street in Greenwich Village and was not amused by the violation of protocol that Castellano's murder represented, was not going to accept the unauthorized removal of a boss without response. Gigante, who had been an ally of Castellano and who commanded the commission structure that the conspirators had bypassed, organized a countermove with assistance from the Lucchese family leadership. On April 13, 1986, Frank DeCicco walked out of a meeting at the Veterans and Friends Social Club in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, and approached his car. A device consisting of C4 plastic explosive had been attached to the undercarriage of his 1985 Buick. When DeCicco got into the passenger seat to retrieve some business cards he had offered to a companion, the bomb detonated. He was 50 years old and died at the scene. The intended primary target was Gotti, who had changed his plans that day and was not present. The bombing delivered the message it was designed to deliver. The unauthorized murder of a boss carried consequences that outlasted the event, and those consequences were applied to the people most responsible. Gotti's public profile continued to build through the late 1980s. He was acquitted at trial 3 times between 1986 and 1990. The acquittals were partly the product of witness reluctance, the same force that had protected organized crime figures for generations, and partly the product of Gotti's genuine ability to cultivate public sympathy in ways that Castellano would never have attempted and would not have known how to manage. The FBI's investigators were not deterred. They placed listening devices inside the Ravenite Social Club, and the conversations recorded there were more incriminating than anything the White House bugs had produced, because Gotti spoke with a freedom that Castellano had never permitted himself in any recorded space. In 1991, Salvatore Gravano decided to cooperate with federal prosecutors. Gravano had been present at, or involved in, the planning and execution of multiple murders, including the murder of Paul Castellano. He had personal direct knowledge of Gotti's authority, decisions, and crimes, extending across years of organizational work. His testimony was specific in ways that surveillance recordings alone could not be specific. He could describe what had been said, who had been present, what decisions had been made, and what the chain of command had looked like from the inside. Combined with the Ravenite recordings, his testimony removed every argument the defense had previously been able to make. Gotti was convicted in April of 1992 on charges of racketeering and murder, and was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He died at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, on June 10th, 2002. He was 61 years old. The organization that Paul Castellano had built and that Gotti had believed he was improving on survived them both, but not in any form that either man would have recognized as the thing he had spent his life managing. The story of Paul Castellano is, in the end, the story of a specific kind of failure, the kind that does not announce itself at any single moment, but accumulates across thousands of small decisions until the person making them has placed themselves in a position that no single correct decision can undo. The White House was not a bad idea. Distance from street-level criminal activity has a genuine protective logic. A boss who is not present at street-level operations is not present at street-level arrests. A boss who conducts business through intermediaries is harder to document in prosecutorial terms than a boss who is physically present at every meeting. Carlo Gambino understood this and had practiced a version of it for 19 years. The distance Carlo maintained was real. What distinguished it from Castellanos was not the distance itself, but the relationships that Carlo had built and maintained in spite of the distance. The specific human connections that meant the men below him believed his interests and their interests pointed in the same direction. Castellano's White House communicated something different. Every trip up the hill that a captain made to pay tribute and receive direction was a trip that communicated, in the language the organization spoke most fluently, that the boss's priorities were the priority, and that the culture of obligation ran in one direction. The men who made those trips were not drawing different conclusions from each other. They were drawing the same conclusion at different speeds, and by December of 1985, the conclusion had become unanimous. The specific series of decisions that made the outcome possible were not individually catastrophic. The mansion was a house, not a declaration of war. The drug prohibition was a practical calculation, not an invitation to conspiracy. The failure to appear at Della Croce's bedside had legal reasoning behind it. The Bilotti appointment was the expression of a preference for personal loyalty that Castellano had demonstrated throughout his career. Each decision, viewed in isolation, had a defensible rationale. Viewed together, they formed a pattern that the men below the hill read correctly. The boss did not consider their world his world, and the culture that was supposed to bind them to each other was operating under terms that only one side was obligated to honor. Carlo Gambino understood that the distance was sustainable only as long as the men below it believed the arrangement was working for them, as well as for the man at the top. He had spent 2 decades making that belief reasonable. Castellano inherited a family that had been built on that belief and then spent 9 years replacing the belief with resentment. Gotti, who replaced him, chose the opposite approach, becoming the most visible boss the family had ever had, and spent the last decade of his life in federal prison. Neither strategy worked in the end. What worked was the organization itself, which survived both of them and continued to operate under the management of men whose names are less famous than Castellanos or Gotti's, and whose deliberate obscurity reflects the lesson that the Hilltop Mansion communicated in the most final possible way. The mansion on Todt Hill was eventually sold. It passed out of Castellano's family's possession and through the real estate market to different owners and different purposes, the way that buildings do when the reason they were built no longer applies. Paul Castellano is buried at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, in the company of many of the men who ran the same world he did, including Carlo Gambino, who built that world and chose him to run it. The hill is still there. It rises 400 feet above the water on the three sides, the highest point on the eastern seaboard south of Maine, still quiet, still elevated, still entirely removed from the street level where the story of the man who lived at the top of it was ultimately decided.